If you have allergies, this time of year can be tough. The problem is pollen. But it's really weird that pollen can make us so miserable. It's not dangerous. It's fundamental to life as we know it. And for basically all of our evolution on land, pollen was all around us. So how have our bodies not figured this out yet? The story starts around 500 million years ago, when plants began to live on land. The male spores of some of the earliest land plants had to swim to find a mate, so early plants needed to stay close to shore. Pollen provided a new way to get around. It helped plants spread across the landscape, eventually creating the grasslands and forests in which we evolved. To find a mate, a single plant has to produce billions of grains of pollen, and only a tiny fraction find their target. That leaves a lot of extra pollen lying around, which for pretty much every land animal ever, wasn't really a problem. That's where the immune system comes in. Like pollen, the adaptive immune system is also hundreds of millions of years old. It protects our bodies from tiny invaders that might hurt us, and it remembers them so that it can be better prepared to fight them off next time. When our immune system catches a whiff of a threat it remembers, it kicks off a chain of reactions that make us cough, sneeze, tear up, and produce lots of mucus to fight off the invaders. People with allergies have immune systems that have learned to see pollen as invaders. Creatures in the wild pretty much don't have this problem. Their immune systems are too busy remembering and fighting off bigger threats. And for most of our history, we were likely the same way. But in the last century, we traded life on the land for air conditioning, clean water, antibiotics. Some scientists think that those changes have left our immune systems confused. The idea is that when we're young, our immune systems need to encounter lots of different microbes, both good and bad, to know what to attack and what to leave alone. But the immune system is immensely complex, and there's still a lot we don't know. Like, why do only some people get allergies? And why do our bodies attack pollen, but not the trillions of helpful bacteria that live in and on us? What we do know is that the way we live for most of our evolution is different than how we live today. Plants make us sneeze because we've changed our world, and our bodies haven't caught up.
1,000 years old and has erupted at least in the last 10,000–15,000 years.
1,000 years seems like a long time to humans, but if a volcano lived for just one day, those 1,000 years would be more like just a few minutes. In other words, these volcanoes aren't done.
There's reasons to believe that it could happen again.
Whether they wake up tomorrow or 1,000 years from now, Seth says around 8 pose the greatest risk, and each has its own personality. Mount Baker puts out a lot of gas, but doesn't erupt very often. Neither does Glacier Peak, though one past eruption was 5 times as big as Mount St. Helens in 1980. Mount Rainier is the tallest mountain in the Northwest, and it isn't likely to blow its top. But it does have a lot of ice, which even small eruptions of hot gas and rock could melt, causing devastating mud flows. Mount St. Helens is still the one to watch. It's the most active in the chain, erupting once or twice a century on average. It's been torn down and remade so many times, the current mountain is only about 4,000 years old, compared to hundreds of thousands of years for other Cascade volcanoes, like Mount Hood. Hood's not far from St. Helens, but its personality is very different.
Mount Hood is not likely to erupt the way Mount St. Helens did.
Mount Hood has a history of venting gas and rock off of its sides, not huge explosions. That's not great news, though. The forces that make mountains and destroy them will continue to stir deep underground for a very long time.
Only to encounter the Columbia River bar, where the Columbia collides with the Pacific. But the real danger lurks below. The Columbia River, the largest in the Pacific Northwest, carries a massive amount of sediment downstream. It creates shipwrecking sandbars that move every season.
If a mariner was approaching the river with a 4-year-old chart, good luck.
Food and eliminating sugars. But there was this larger message unfolding. Our choices as consumers matter. Diet for a Small Planet made a compelling case for vegetarianism. Global hunger could be solved if we use the soy fed to animals for humans instead. More and more people were dropping meat for tofu and swapping white bread for whole grain, but finding some of these foods was difficult. Leonard took some leftover rice pilaf at his Gresham restaurant, added mushrooms, oats, and cheese, baked it, and invented the garden burger, the first veggie patty to go mainstream.
He had the technology of stamping out these burgers, 60 of these a minute, and in an hour he'd have a pallet of them. What he could do in an hour took me 2 days.
Imagine your old car dies and you need a new one. You don't really have the money for the car you want, so you either have to get a raise or a side hustle or just get a cheaper car. That's Oregon right now. The car is the state budget, all the things the government is trying to pay for. And the state government doesn't have the money for the car it wants. There are lots of reasons Oregon might need money. Rising pension costs, healthcare, it all adds up to mean state government can't keep up its current levels of service without more money. So what do you do about that? It depends on what you value. If your main concern is keeping up services, like the Oregon Health Plan, you see this problem as a budget gap that needs to be filled with more money. But if you're more concerned with taxes, you don't see this as a gap exactly. It's more like the government's just trying to spend too much. This is a classic divide in politics, and it leads to a sort of game. One side looks for more money, while the other side tries to limit the options. That brings us to Measure 104. And, okay, this is gonna get a little wonky, so buckle up. Back in 1996, voters added a new rule to Oregon's budget game. If the government wants to raise taxes, it doesn't just need a majority of votes, it needs a supermajority. 3/5 of all the votes in the state House and Senate. That's hard to do, so it's hard to raise taxes, which is kind of the point. Flash forward to today, and Democrats are in charge, but they don't have a supermajority, which means they can't raise taxes on their own to fill that budget gap. So they've been looking at other ways to come up with more money. One of those options is to cut tax breaks. Oregon has around 350 state tax breaks. They let you use things like small business expenses or the interest on a mortgage to pay less in tax. Getting rid of a tax break brings in more money for the government without technically raising taxes. Measure 104 would require a supermajority to get rid of tax breaks, or really pass any law that gives the government more money. So why does any of this matter? Supporters of 104 say cutting tax breaks is just like raising taxes. It's not something we should let lawmakers do easily. And we should find other ways to fix Oregon's budget problems. Opponents say supermajorities give a small group of lawmakers the power to veto laws that the public supports. And they say 104 would make it easy to create new tax breaks, but hard to change them if they don't work. Either way, with Measure 104, voters will be shaping how we pay for government for years to come.
Horses in the world. Only 34 horses from any other state outside Kentucky have won the Derby in its over 140-year history. And Oregon isn't a big thoroughbred.
Measure 101 would approve a new tax on healthcare providers to help continue health coverage for people on the Oregon Health Plan. Voting yes means the new tax will go ahead as planned. Voting no means there won't be a tax. Sounds simple enough, but there's a lot more to the story. Ultimately, Measure 101 is an attempt to close a giant hole in the state budget. That hole comes mainly from healthcare. Over the last few years, Oregon expanded its healthcare program for people who couldn't otherwise afford health insurance. That's the Oregon Health Plan, our version of Medicaid. The money to expand the plan came from the federal government, thanks to the Affordable Care Act. That boost brought the total number of people on the Oregon Health Plan to over 1 million, or roughly 1 in 4 Oregonians. And it meant that 95% of people in the state now have some form of health coverage. Part of the deal was always that the feds would gradually reduce their payments, meaning Oregon would eventually have to pick up more of the bill. And that time has come. To keep the Oregon health plan at current levels, the state needs to replace what the feds are taking away. In 2017, the Oregon legislature passed a bill that would raise the money. Part of that bill was a temporary assessment, let's just call it a tax, on hospitals, private insurers, and other healthcare providers. The tax would get us through to 2019, when it would end, and all of this would need to be figured out again. A group of around 160 organizations, including many of the groups that would be taxed, supported the bill. Why? More people with health coverage means fewer expensive emergency room visits, saving money in the long run. The bill passed, but a group of Republicans still objected to the new tax and started a petition to give voters the last word. And now we vote. Opponents of the measure say that the tax unfairly targets some types of health coverage, and that it's just a short-term fix. Supporters of the measure say without the tax, around 350,000 people on the Oregon health plan could potentially lose coverage. And there's an added wrinkle. In 2017, a state audit found that the Oregon Health Authority, the agency that would ultimately be responsible for spending the money from Measure 101, misspent millions of dollars and didn't effectively track waste and fraud in the healthcare system. Voters will decide Measure 101 on January 23rd. If the measure passes, the tax will go into effect as planned. If the measure fails, the legislature will have to find a new way to fill the billion-dollar hole in its budget when it meets again in February.